The air was still heavy with moisture when Helen Ward vanished on the edge of Lexington County, South Carolina. Population 10,214, February 1965, arrived with thin rains that coated red dust across the land bordering the Congaree forest. In the late afternoon, Helen's neighbor, Mrs. Ruth Callahan, saw the 19-year-old University of South Carolina student wearing a thin, smoke-colored coat, holding a notebook, stepping out of the boarding house on Blossom Street. Helen said she would take a walk around the block before dark, a habit she had kept since the Christmas break. The older woman stood on the porch, watching Helen's figure gradually disappear behind the row of trees leading to the abandoned scaffolding site of Lexington Scaffold and Lumber. The beige canvas bag on her shoulder was the last thing visible in the descending gray mist. What happened in less than an hour after that would haunt South Carolina for 36 years. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In 1965, South Carolina was experiencing significant population shifts as new industrial areas sprang up and construction projects continuously expanded into the suburbs. Lexington County lay in the middle of that transition zone, where scattered residential rows interspersed with vacant lots, waste lumber yards, and unpaved dirt roads. On the southern edge of the county, the area near the Congaree forest still retained its rugged appearance. Trails disappearing into low brush, dirt roads winding along the forest edge, a few old boarding houses for students, and the abandoned construction site of Lexington Scaffold and Lumber, standing isolated like the remnant of an unfinished project. Helen Ward, a University of South Carolina student, lived in a small rented room near Blossom Street, where rows of two-story wooden houses formed a quiet residential area, mostly occupied by students and temporary workers. That afternoon, as had been her habit for many months, Helen left her boarding house to walk around the area, choosing the dirt road leading south toward the Congaree forest, where the air was fresher and there was less traffic. A witness living nearby saw Helen for the last time as she turned onto the section of road heading toward the abandoned construction site, her hair and compact figure standing out against the fading daylight. When night fully fell and the windows around the boarding house lit up, Helen had not returned. Her roommate began to worry, walking along the familiar route the two often took together, but finding no sign of Helen. Multiple calls to the family phone yielded no new information, as Helen's failure to return dragged on and no one could reach her. The family was informed of the situation and immediately recognized the abnormality. Unable to determine Helen's whereabouts themselves and fearing something had happened on the desolate stretch near the Congaree forest, the family decided to contact the Lexington County Sheriff's Office directly to report her missing. At the sheriff's office, the call was logged in the late evening, when the night shift force had dwindled to just a few deputies handling emergencies. Initial information was received over the phone. Helen Ward, USC student, left her boarding house in the afternoon and did not return by dark, unreachable, left no message, and her roommate confirmed searching the familiar route, but finding no sign. The duty officer proceeded to collect basic details about Helen's identity, including age, student status, residence, health condition, daily habits, and closest relationships. Reports from that era focused on determining whether the missing person had a history of running away, family conflicts, or signs of depression, but the family affirmed that Helen exhibited no behavior suggesting voluntary departure. Nevertheless, the prevailing mindset of law enforcement in 1965 South Carolina prioritized assuming that adults often returned after a few hours or overnight, especially in cases lacking clear evidence of immediate danger. The information gap: no one witnessed Helen in distress, no cries for help, no signs of struggle, led the duty officer to classify the case as temporary loss of contact rather than high risk. After completing procedural questions and logging the report, the duty deputy suggested monitoring activity at the boarding house until morning, arguing that deploying a search at night was impractical due to Lexington County's many dark dirt roads, the vast unlit Congaree forest, and the limited night staff, sufficient only for accidents or high-level emergencies. The family urged faster action, but under the standards of the time, an adult's disappearance was considered concerning only after a certain period if they did not reappear. As a result, the sheriff's office decided not to mobilize a search team that night, but recorded Helen Ward's information in the monitoring list, awaiting the next morning to proceed with further steps per 1965 protocol. The next morning, when the sheriff's office was fully staffed, the first patrol team was dispatched to the boarding house where Helen lived to verify the family's report and gather the latest information before expanding the scope. The room inspection was conducted according to regulations of the time, observing the overall living space, noting belongings, neatness, and any signs indicating Helen left in haste or with preparation. Helen's room remained in its usual state according to her roommate, books on the desk, personal items in place, no open suitcase, no signs of packing or taking essentials. The bed was not unusually disturbed, clothing was not missing beyond what the roommate knew, and the door showed no pry marks or external tampering. The deputy noted clearly in the report that Helen left no note or message, consistent with the family's information that she had no reason for temporary departure. After inspecting the room, the assigned team moved along nearby apartments to interview residents in the immediate radius. Several confirmed seeing Helen walk out of the boarding house the previous afternoon, but not returning by dark. The time frame from afternoon to evening was consistently described by multiple households. The area was quite quiet, with virtually no strangers present, no unusual sounds, and no recorded conflicts or arguments around the boarding house. Helen's roommate provided additional details the family did not fully know. Daily schedule, usual walking route, typical return time, and habit of not venturing far in the evening. The roommate also confirmed Helen had no plans to meet anyone, no mention of leaving Lexington, and no signs of stress or unusual changes in behavior in the preceding weeks. The deputy recorded all this testimony as it helped reinforce the assessment that Helen did not leave intentionally. The team continued gathering information from households along Blossom Street, prioritizing locations with views of the route Helen took from the boarding house. Several saw Helen walking the familiar path alone, with no one accompanying her and no suspicious vehicles following or stopping near her at that time. However, a few residents admitted paying little attention to passers-by when Helen left, as it was the hour when people were occupied with their own activities, so no one had significant additional information. These notes were added to the report to complete the picture of Helen's final moments in the residential area. By late morning, the boarding house inspection and resident interviews helped law enforcement determine that Helen did not leave prepared, did not take necessary belongings, and exhibited no prior indication. From here, the team shifted to mapping Helen's usual afternoon walking route. The roommate provided key information. Helen habitually left Blossom Street, crossed a dirt road section heading south, then followed the Congaree forest edge, sometimes going farther to the abandoned Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, where only old wooden frames and scattered rusted materials remained. Based on that description, the route was sketched simply, reflecting 1965 Lexington County's traffic and terrain: dirt roads, unmarked trails, abandoned material yards, and forested border areas with obstructed visibility. This route was outlined as a curved loop starting from Helen's boarding house, extending through 3 distinct zones with varying characteristics and risk levels, becoming the focus for the day's field sweep. The first identified area was the abandoned Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, where multiple witnesses had seen Helen and which held the only matching testimony about her last sighting. The site was left after project funding stopped, leaving old wooden scaffolding, unfinished walls, foundation pits, and open lots glimpsed among trees. This was a high-risk area, materials strewn about, unmanaged, occasionally visited by day laborers or local youths gathering. The location was far enough from residences that no one would hear or see an incident, while its complex structure made overlooking details during checks highly likely. The second key location was the Congaree Forest entrance, a narrow road connecting from a dirt branch near Blossom Street into dense tree cover, rarely traveled, with no lighting. The 1965 Congaree forest was entirely natural, with large roots, tall brush, low terrain, constantly damp, and likely to leave few traces if a walker veered deep without returning. Additionally, as it fell outside regular patrol oversight, any incident there would be hard to detect promptly. This required thorough checking, but due to vast area and branching trails, it needed careful planning to avoid early forced dispersion. The third location was along Congaree Creek, east of Helen's usual route. This was not a frequent spot per the roommate, but within radius if she extended her walk that day. The bank had small descents, scattered rocks mixed with mud, some sections obscured by canopy. The flow could be strong at times, increasing accident risk near water in late afternoon. Since no witnesses saw Helen head there, priority was lower than the other two, but the team agreed it could not be fully excluded without field checks. After marking the three key areas, the sheriff's office ranked risk levels to sequence checks that day. First, the abandoned site, last confirmed sighting, and highest potential for foul play due to complexity and isolation. Next, the forest entrance, natural hazards requiring sectional checks to confirm if Helen entered. Finally, Congaree Creek Bank, lower relevance, but still within scope for full exclusion. This plan was based on 1965 realities. Investigators lacked modern equipment, strong searchlighting, or specialized forest vehicles with limited intergroup communication. Thus, priority went to the most confirmed location to avoid early dispersion. By late morning, Helen's route map was relatively complete. 3 key sites identified and check order agreed, laying groundwork for phased field sweeps to seek any sign. Helen passed through or encountered trouble on her familiar path. As midday transitioned into early afternoon, the search team began implementing the first step, sweeping the residential area around Blossom Street. The starting point of Helen's journey, and the place most likely to show early traces if an incident occurred just before she turned onto the dirt road leading toward Congaree Forest. The deputies divided into 3 small groups to cover as much ground as possible around the boarding house, including the 2-story wooden row houses, the side paths connecting the apartments, the vacant lots interspersed among the temporary structures, and the main road where many students, workers, and residents passed through. This residential area in 1965 lacked clear planning. Some lots had been abandoned after stalled construction projects. There were a few temporary material storage yards, and narrow dirt paths had formed over time from frequent foot traffic. Each such spot had the potential to retain traces if Helen had passed through or if any collision had occurred. First, the search team returned to Helen's boarding house to reconstruct once more her path from the room door to the complex gate, observing the ground, low bushes, and the common yard where students sometimes exercised in the afternoons. There were no signs of disturbance, no unfamiliar objects, no unusually trampled areas. They expanded the search to the road surface in front, where a few people often sat on porches in the late afternoon, but according to statements, no one had seen anything unusual the previous day. The dirt road still bore old tire tracks, but there were no new or unusual ones indicating abrupt stops or turns near the boarding house. Everything aligned with statements that the residential area had been very quiet that afternoon. The second group followed the narrow side paths on both sides of Blossom Street, paths just wide enough for 2 people to pass each other, leading to old houses or storage sheds owned by landlords. They scanned each section, pushing aside low bushes along the edges to check, but the dry ground showed no new footprints or personal items potentially linked to Helen. These side paths were closest to the boarding house, so if an incident had occurred, traces would likely remain, but the results were empty. The group also checked the narrow spaces between rows of houses, where some residents left trash bins or stacked old wooden planks. They looked for signs of struggle, abandoned shoes, or anything unusual, but everything was as usual: household trash boxes, a few old boards and clumps of weeds. The third group was assigned to check the larger road leading to the nearby small commercial area, including dusty parking lots and vacant land where plans for a row of shops had been abandoned midway. This was the area where concern arose that a strange vehicle could stop and wait or approach a pedestrian without drawing attention. They scanned the road edges, crisscrossing tire tracks, and the lot where local youths sometimes lit bonfires at night, but found no specific signs of Helen or suspicious activity from the previous afternoon. At each marked area requiring closer inspection, the search team examined the ground for any light objects like a handkerchief, scrap of paper, or small purse, but discovered nothing. One deputy reiterated that Helen had not been carrying much while walking, though this information had not yet been verified through physical evidence, so they continued to thoroughly search every spot that might have been overlooked. After completing the first sweep, all three groups agreed that the residential area around the boarding house revealed no direct traces suggesting Helen had encountered danger there. No cries for help had been heard by anyone, no strangers had been identified at the time she left the complex, and there were no unusual changes to the ground or in residents' activities. Although this result yielded no progress, it helped the investigation narrow the scope and reinforced the belief that Helen had left the residential area without incident in the immediate vicinity. They continued expanding the search to farther side paths, connecting Blossom Street to the dirt road leading to Congaree Forest, but still only noted bushes, dry ground, and a few old tire marks of undetermined age. A veteran deputy on the team reminded everyone that areas like this in 1965 had no surveillance cameras, no streetlights, and very few people out in the late afternoon, so if someone had been following Helen, or if sudden intervention occurred, it would almost certainly go unwitnessed. However, the lack of physical evidence did not remove the residential area from the list of key focuses. It simply provided no information to alter the search direction. By late afternoon, after sweeping the entire area around the boarding house, the search team drafted a report confirming no signs of incident, conflict, or unusual movement related to Helen. The residential area was deemed clean by initial search standards, allowing forces to shift focus to more complex terrain, areas Helen might have passed through after leaving the boarding house, and points with significantly higher risk levels. Immediately after collecting all observations in the residential area, the team shifted to gathering witness statements, beginning by going door to door along the route from Blossom Street to the dirt turnoff into Congaree Forest and the abandoned construction site. In the context of Lexington County in 1965, witnesses relied primarily on memory, observational habits, and what they considered out of the ordinary compared to typical days, as the area was generally quiet with few strangers appearing. All statements were recorded on the sheriff's office's standard forms to ensure no details were missed, though their reliability could not yet be assessed. The first witnesses approached were a married couple living a short distance from the Congaree Forest entrance. The husband stated that on the afternoon Helen disappeared, he saw a dark green pickup truck parked close to the abandoned construction site, a small enclosed bed truck typically used for hauling materials, not common in the area since the project was halted. According to him, the truck idled for a while, then shut off and started again, as if the driver was waiting for someone. However, he could not clearly see the driver due to the late afternoon light and distance. His wife added that she saw no other unusual activity, only remembering the loud engine noise echoing across the open lot, something she rarely heard at that time of day. Continuing along the route, the search team approached a middle-aged woman living in a wooden house near the forest turnoff. She stated that on that afternoon, she saw a strange man standing at the forest edge, tall and thin, wearing a dark hat, appearing to look into the dense trees. She said he was not a local resident. She was certain because she had lived in the area for years and knew most regular passers-by. When asked if the man had been watching Helen or if his presence related to the time she turned onto the dirt road, she confirmed she had not seen Helen and could not determine if the stranger appeared before or after she passed. The only thing she clearly remembered was that the man turned away quickly when she stepped into the yard, making her feel uneasy, though she thought he might just be a lost worker. The next witness was a small shop owner near the end of the main road, who usually locked up in the late afternoon. He said that around the suspected time, he heard the sound of a vehicle accelerating hard on the dirt road, unusually loud, since most traffic here consisted of small cars or students' bicycles. He described the engine noise as that of a truck or material hauler, but did not see it because he was in the back of the shop and only heard the sound carry over. He also could not determine the direction, only noting that a lot of dust was kicked up, as he later saw a fine layer hanging in the air. A young man living across from the dirt road into Congaree Forest provided similar information. He heard a loud engine and tires grinding on dry ground, but when he ran to the porch, no vehicle was in sight. This could mean the vehicle had turned toward the abandoned site or driven out of view. All statements related to vehicle sounds were fully recorded, though it could not yet be determined if they directly related to Helen's disappearance or were just normal activity by someone in the area. Beyond these notable statements, the search team approached other households along the route, but most reported not seeing Helen that afternoon or remembering anything noteworthy. An elderly man said he glimpsed a young woman walking quickly toward Congaree Forest, but was unsure if it was Helen, as he only saw her briefly through the window in fading light. Another resident said she heard dogs barking briefly, which was odd for a quiet afternoon, but she did not think much of it since local dogs sometimes reacted to wildlife. The sheriff's office recorded all these statements, even though they lacked sufficient detail to determine relevance. The green truck, the strange man at the forest edge, and the loud vehicle sounds near the time of Helen's disappearance were all entered into the file as elements to track in subsequent steps. However, under 1965 investigation procedures, authorities did not yet analyze or prioritize the statements, as accurate evaluation could only occur after completing field searches and gathering additional corroborating data. At this stage, the goal of compiling statements was simply to ensure no details from residents along the route were missed, thereby forming a list of points for further checks as the search expanded beyond the residential area. Once all statements were documented and organized, the team immediately moved to the area assessed as highest risk and the last place witnesses saw Helen, the abandoned Lexington Scaffold and Lumber construction site. This site lay farther in than the residential area, separated by stretches of hard brown soil and an old truck path eroded by years of weather. What remained were rotted wooden scaffolding frames, a few unfinished foundations, and large planks scattered around. As the search team entered, they noted near absolute silence, broken only by wind-sweeping old metal sheets, creating chaotic sounds enough to make one imagine human movement, if not observing closely. The sweep was organized by a clear grid, each deputy responsible for a strip from the outer edge to the center, ensuring no area that could hide traces was missed. The ground was uneven, mixed with small concrete slabs and abandoned foundation pits, requiring slow and careful searching. The team checked every corner, unfinished wall, and sunken patch, hoping to find signs Helen had passed or any related personal items. However, after nearly an hour, they found no clear traces, no new shoe prints, no dropped items, no shifts in the easily marked material planks if touched. Still, what made the site significant was the statement about the dark green truck seen nearby at the time of Helen's disappearance. Thus, the investigation expanded by collecting the list of workers recently employed there. Though abandoned, some seasonal workers were still hired to remove materials or maintain old structures. The Lexington Scaffold and Lumber office kept simple paper records, mainly daily attendance lists, day wages, and material transport reports. From these, the sheriff's office obtained the list of workers present during the week of Helen's disappearance. It included 8 men, mostly seasonal laborers from Lexington County and Casey. The investigation contacted each, scheduling statements or quick on-site interviews if they agreed. 7 of the 8 confirmed they were not working the afternoon Helen disappeared. They stated their shifts ended early afternoon, and by the incident time, they had left. When asked about the green truck, most said the company occasionally rented various trucks for hauling, but they did not recall specific colors or plates, as changes were routine. However, one worker said he had seen the dark green truck that week, but could not confirm it appeared on the exact day. Among the 7 interviewed, none provided suspicious information about colleagues or strangers around the site, but one case could not be verified. Richard Paulson, the only one absent on the recorded workday. Records showed Paulson regularly worked there, handling cleanup and light machinery. However, when contacted, the contractor said Paulson had not shown up since mid-last week without explanation. This absence was noted in attendance, but elicited no response. Though nothing could be concluded, the investigation noted Paulson as the only one not directly interviewed initially and possibly needing follow-up if more information emerged. In addition to questioning workers, the search team conducted a second sweep of the site, focusing on hidden spots and deeper pits with standing rainwater. One deputy checked the scaffolding row behind where the green truck was reportedly seen, but found no signs Helen had approached. The hard, dry ground retained no new prints. Planks remained in place, undisturbed. No scratches, drag marks, or Helen's personal items were found. After over 2 hours of continuous searching, the investigation concluded the site yielded no direct evidence. However, as the last place Helen was seen and the only one with statements about a suspicious vehicle, it remained on the monitoring list. They noted no specific suspect to be established. The green truck's owner unidentified, the strange man lacking clear descriptors, and the sole absent worker, Richard Paulson, still unreachable for a statement. Despite no direct traces at the scene, the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site was retained as a key focus in narrowing the scope, especially as more complex terrain potentially linked to Helen deviating from her usual route became the primary concern. Based on the construction site yielding no specific signs leading to Helen, the search team moved to the next focal location on the route map. The banks of Congaree Creek, a low-lying area stretching along the eastern waterfront of Lexington County, where the terrain constantly shifted across strips of mud, low grass patches, and dense clusters of trees clinging close to the river's edge. Although Helen's roommate confirmed that she rarely ventured as far as this area, since the travel radius still fell within reachable distance by foot from the boarding house, the sheriff's office decided to deploy the search team in the established order to completely rule out the possibility that Helen had gotten lost or met with an unwitnessed accident. As the team approached the riverside area, the first thing they noted was the uneven terrain. Some sections of the bank sloped gently down to the water's edge, but others suddenly dipped into deep, muddy sinks where a single misstep could cause someone to slide into the current. There were no natural barriers for protection, and for many years the area had seen little maintenance or clearing. This meant that any pedestrian unfamiliar with the path could easily lose balance, especially in the late afternoon, when light faded and many sections relied more on feel than sight. The search team split into 2 groups, each responsible for a stretch of the riverbank extending from the main access point to 2 side branches, while also having members carefully observe the informal trails created by local fishermen or children. Identifying these trails was critically important because if Helen had ever come to this area, there was a high chance she would have inadvertently followed one of them, especially if she was looking for a shortcut back or curiously ventured farther after leaving the construction site or Congaree forest. The first group started from the higher ground section, where the riverbank curved into a narrow bend with large exposed rocks. This was assessed as a likely area for slips and falls, so they closely examined the ground for footprints, slide marks, or scratches that might remain. However, the soil here was very dry, hard, and full of small pebbles, making it nearly impossible for traces to be imprinted unless there had been a strong slide. After many minutes checking each rock and low bush along the water's edge, the search group found nothing unusual. They continued along the wider riverbank stretch, where there was more mud and low grass growing in patches, but the traces only indicated normal wildlife activity from deer, foxes, and a few water birds. All signs were natural, continuous, and showed no sudden disruption, suggesting the presence of a person the previous afternoon. The second group handled the remaining section of the riverbank, which was considered more complex due to numerous small side streams flowing into Congaree Creek as shallow channels. Here, the terrain changed rapidly within just a few meters, from dry ground to thin mud, from thick grass to scattered pebbles. They began by checking spots that could obscure visibility, including dense tree clusters, fallen trunks, and low earth depressions. One deputy spotted a small trail that appeared man-made, as there were signs of trampling on the low grass patches, causing them to break close to the ground. However, following the trail deeper, the group realized it led to a familiar local fishing spot, marked by a few old tin cans and an abandoned length of fishing line. This indicated the trail was not newly formed and unrelated to Helen. Nonetheless, the team recorded and marked it to rule out any oversight. As they continued along the water's edge, some sections showed grass pushed to one side, suggesting something had passed through, but the responsible deputy assessed it as very likely the trace of a large animal, like a deer crossing the bank to drink. Tree trunks and the ground showed no clear human footprints. The drag marks on the mud were neither deep enough nor shaped to confirm they were caused by a heavy object being pulled, as the mud layer here often flooded and receded, easily creating natural patterns. As the afternoon shifted to pale golden light, the search team moved to scan less obvious spots, particularly small raised earth mounds a few meters from the water's edge. These were positions where many people could stand to observe the river without being hindered by mud. But once again, the group only found old bottle caps, rotted cigarette butts, and a few small animal slides. No personal items, no fabric scraps, no foreign objects among the grass. Both groups then reunited at an intersection point for a quick summary of findings. There was no direct evidence that Helen had been to the banks of Congaree Creek on the afternoon of her disappearance. No witnesses saw her turn toward this area. No physical traces matched a pedestrian passing through at the suspected time, and no clues involving personal belongings, which are often key factors in missing persons cases if an accident occurred. However, the team also noted that finding nothing did not mean completely ruling out the riverside area. The unpredictable terrain, constant changes in mud and water levels, and lack of stable traces meant the search team could not make any definitive assertions. At the end of the search day, they confirmed that the Congaree Creek banks provided no clear connection to Helen's disappearance, but the area had been thoroughly searched according to 1965 standards and was no longer in the high-priority group. This allowed the force to shift focus to other directions with more variables and potential direct links to the last route Helen took. As the riverside check concluded without new signs, the search team began compiling all areas searched in the first 2 days and proceeded to the initial evidence collection phase, a critical stage but heavily limited by South Carolina's 1965 technology. The goal was not on-site analysis, but recording, collecting, and preserving any objects that appeared out of their natural place or had even a slight chance of relating to Helen's disappearance. The first site revisited was the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber construction area, where previous searches had focused on major traces but not thoroughly on small items mixed in rotten wood and debris. In this more detailed check, one deputy found a pale-colored fabric scrap under the base of a collapsed scaffold frame, obscured by sawdust and small fragments. The fabric piece was not large, only about half a palm size, felt old to the touch, but its color and material prompted immediate recording, since it did not match common construction fabrics used there. The scrap had no distinctive pattern, just a torn edge, but per procedure, it was logged with exact location, discovery time, handler's name, and initial preservation method. Also in the construction site, another deputy found a thin metal wire segment draped over an old plank. The wire was not long, slightly over a handspan, bent at one end with rust signs. In the context of the site, Once using various wires for tying lumber or securing materials, it could simply be left over, but since it lay in an open area, rarely trodden or disturbed, the investigation team collected it to ensure no detail was missed. The wire was gently coiled, placed in a paper bag, and labeled per the era's simple sealing procedure. Leaving the construction site, the team continued searching along the dirt path toward the Congaree forest, where trees created a characteristic deep shade even in mid-afternoon. At a bend where thick grass could hide small objects, one deputy found a mud-smeared, water-stained paper scrap, apparently blown there before catching under low grass. The paper was nearly illegible due to blurred ink, but a few bold marks remained at the top corner. By 1965 standards, any paper found within the search perimeter had to be collected since there was no quick way to assess relevance, and handwriting or document experts, if needed, could only examine manually with magnifiers and experience. Such small potential evidence was easily overlooked in initial searches, but the sheriff's office emphasized never immediately dismissing any object, even if seemingly trivial. Evidence collection in 1965 faced many constraints. No clear plastic seal bags, no fiber trace or DNA analysis systems, no optical scanners or on-site chemical testing devices. Instead, items were placed in thick paper bags or cardboard boxes, labeled with ink pen and signed by the collector. All were stored in small wooden crates to prevent damage from impact or weather. These limitations required investigators to be especially careful in describing the initial condition, as any post-collection change could render information meaningless. Returning to the Congaree Creek banks for a final sweep, in hopes of finding overlooked small evidence, the search team only located a few rotted trash items, tin cans, cigarette packs, that they deemed unrelated. The riverbank ground from the previous day had shown no signs, and finding no new evidence reinforced that if Helen had been there, traces had been erased by mud or water. The team noted no fabric, paper, or personal items, matching descriptions of what Helen typically carried while walking. After collecting 3 items, the pale fabric scrap, metal wire segment, and smeared paper, the responsible team completed the summary report per 1965 Sheriff's Office procedure, detailing discovery location, involved personnel, item condition, and weather factors that could affect it. Though each item had a chance of being unrelated to Helen, they were fully preserved since this phase focused not on deep analysis, but ensuring every anomaly in the search area was secured before time or environment altered it. The initial evidence collection, while yielding no new leads to Helen, laid the groundwork for subsequent reviews, where each item, no matter how small, could become a linking point if later information emerged. After completing initial evidence collection and cross-referencing all recorded statements, the investigation team proceeded to the next critical step, determining the point of last sighting, the final position where Helen's presence could be confirmed based on factual information, while delineating the area with no witnesses seeing or hearing anything related. Compiled data showed Helen left the boarding house in the afternoon, following her usual path toward the dirt road beside Congaree Forest. A single witness saw her enter the section heading toward the abandoned construction site. Afterward, her entire route went unseen by anyone. Residential area searches found no unusual traces and no statements indicating an incident near Blossom Street. Simultaneously, Congaree Creek bank searches yielded nothing. And the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, despite the green truck sighting, showed no signs of Helen entering deeper. Plotting all information on the initial route map revealed a clear gap. The forest section between the residential area and construction site, where trees were dense, trails unstable, and visibility obstructed in many spots. This was the area, with no witnesses confirming Helen passing through or returning, nor any reports of vehicles, noises, or unusual activity in the suspected time frame, making it the sole silent zone on the entire route. The investigation team marked this area as high risk for several reasons. First, it was a road section with no homes. weak light, and no clear path beyond worn trails used by locals to shorten distances. Second, it bordered Congaree Forest, where tree and brush density could completely block views from the main road. Third, it was the intermediary segment between Helen's last sighting and the construction site with no traces, making the chance of an incident here more notable than anywhere else. This was not mere speculation, but based on the reconstructed movement log from detailed roommate questioning. Helen often walked this section alone, unafraid to detour into wooded paths to avoid sun, and had done so many times before looping toward the construction site. The forest floor here was even harder to mark than the riverside due to constant leaf litter cover, easily erasing light footprints via wind or animals. By cross-referencing Helen's estimated travel time with resident reports of loud engine sounds, the team noted the vehicle noise timeframe perfectly overlapped when Helen might have entered the forest. However, without direct witnesses seeing a vehicle or driver there, it was only noted, not sufficient to trace her subsequent movements. Summarizing all data, the confirmed point of last sighting was the dirt road leading into Congaree Forest, just beyond the witness's final view of Helen. From there onward, all possible directions became unknowns, with no homes, no passers-by, and no distinctive evidence to determine which branch she took. Thus, the investigation team designated this area as the highest risk zone and focus of the next search phase. Though unable to conclude Helen met trouble here, establishing the point of last sighting helped narrow the scope, exclude thoroughly checked areas, and concentrate resources on the location most likely to hold key information. Identifying this gap, the zone without witnesses, traces, or sounds, became a crucial foundation for subsequent approaches in determining where Helen actually vanished. Immediately after identifying the stretch of woods between the residential area and the construction site as Helen's point of disappearance, the investigation team shifted to processing one of the most notable leads from witness statements, a dark green pickup truck seen near the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site around the time in question. In 1965, tracking down a vehicle based solely on color and type descriptions was a complex task because the county's vehicle registration system was fragmented, relied on manual paperwork, and lacked any electronic database for quick cross-referencing. However, since one witness had described the truck as dark green and resembling a small box-style truck used for hauling materials, the team decided to compile a list of all green Ford trucks registered in Lexington County and adjacent areas. This list was pulled directly from registration records at the Tax and Inspection Office, which were manually organized by year of manufacture and owner, not by color. As a result, the deputies had to review each record individually, noting those described as green or dark green, then filtering for models matching a small Ford box truck. After hours of cross-checking, the initial list yielded about 24 vehicles that closely matched the description, most belonging to lumber contractors, construction workers, or small business owners. The next step was to prioritize checking owners who lived or worked within close proximity to the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, since the likelihood of a dark green truck being parked near the site at the time Helen vanished would be higher if the owner was local. The team organized the list by geographic distance. Owners within a 5-mile radius were placed at the top, followed by those within 10 miles, and then farther cases. Deputies visited each address in turn, noting the vehicle's location, asking owners about their use of the truck on the day Helen disappeared, and verifying whether anyone else had permission to use it besides the owner. Most owners were home or at work, cooperative, and willing to provide information. Several green trucks were found in owners' garages with no signs of unusual use, and tires showed no mud or soil similar to the Congaree Woods area. A few owners stated they had used their trucks all day for hauling lumber, and some were confirmed sighted farther south in the county, details that were noted for cross-verification. There were a handful of cases requiring follow-up because owners could not clearly recall the truck's activity at the time in question, but no one appeared evasive or avoidant. However, a major disadvantage at this stage was that no witness had clearly seen the license plate, or any distinctive features of the dark green truck near the site, making elimination based on on-site observation difficult. Moreover, truck paint in the 1960s often faded over time, and many vehicles were repainted by hand, rendering comparisons to the witness-described dark green color less accurate. During the screening, the team also tried to determine whether the dark green truck might be linked to the absent worker, Richard Paulson, the only one on the worker list who could not be reached after the site shut down. However, at that point, no record showed Paulson owning a personal truck. According to the contractor, Paulson usually got to the site by riding with coworkers or using temporary rentals, but no one clearly remembered what vehicle he had used or who had given him a ride most recently. This prevented the team from linking the dark green truck to Paulson, even though his absence remained a noted factor. After 2 days of screening the truck list, the investigation concluded that none of the initial vehicles convincingly matched the one seen near the site. No plates were identified, no models perfectly matched, and there were no indications that any had been used covertly at the time Helen vanished. Though it yielded no breakthrough, this screening step was still valuable, as it eliminated most green trucks in the county from suspicion, forcing the investigators to shift focus to other factors potentially more directly related. From the results of filtering the truck list and data collected at the scene, the team proceeded to the next task, compiling a list of potential suspects based on the 3 groups most likely to have had contact with Helen during the window of her disappearance. The first group included all workers who had been employed at the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, especially those present during the week of the incident. The list of 8 workers had been verified, with 7 fully cooperating and having witnesses or clear timelines for the day. Helen vanished. Only one, Richard Paulson, could not be located. However, beyond Paulson's unusual absence, the team had no evidence or statements placing him near Helen's route, approaching her, or driving the dark green truck witnesses saw. Paulson was added to the list with a note of unverified, but lacked sufficient factors to rank as a high-level suspect. The second group consisted of drivers of green trucks in Lexington County and bordering areas. The list of over 24 vehicles was checked in person, with all owners providing details on schedules, who used the trucks, and vehicle locations on the day of the disappearance. None showed suspicious signs, no mud traces, no unusual activity, and no owners who were evasive or avoided questioning. Some trucks were dark green, but their locations during the time Helen vanished were all verified by independent witnesses. Thus, the truck driver group produced no persons of interest, and the truck seen by witnesses remained owner unknown. The third group included residents living near the Congaree woods and the dirt road Helen traveled. The team screened those living close to the forest turnoff, places where someone might have heard or seen something unusual that afternoon. Based on collected statements, one woman reported seeing a strange man at the forest edge, but the description was too vague for identification. Tall build, wearing a dark hat, standing with his back to the homes. The team attempted to contact all male residents in the area for basic appearance comparisons, but none specifically matched. Additionally, no men were noted as absent or present in unreasonable locations at the time in question. A few other residents only reported hearing a loud engine, but saw no strangers, no unusual behavior, and no one saw Helen after she left the residential area. When combining the 3 groups, the sheriff's office realized no individual had sufficient elements to constitute a suspect at this stage. No clear motive, no unusual behavior, no traces matching Helen's path, and no physical evidence linking anyone to the scene. The disparate elements, the dark green truck, the strange man, the absent worker, all lacked direct connections and were insufficient to elevate to formal suspicion. The potential suspect list thus remained in the form of persons to monitor upon new leads, with no one detained for in-depth interrogation. This was the point where investigators had to acknowledge a large gap between what witnesses saw and what actually occurred in the woods where Helen's trail ended, leaving the investigation broadened, but without a solid enough foothold to advance further. When the suspect list yielded no viable leads, and daytime searches produced limited results, the sheriff's office decided to deploy a support measure rarely used in 1965, missing persons cases. Organizing a nighttime search with scent-tracking dogs, particularly bloodhounds known for their keen sense of smell and suitability for dense forest terrain. Mobilizing scent dogs at night was seen as a last-ditch effort to locate any viable trail before the investigation had to scale back due to lack of grounds. The K-9 team was brought in from a neighboring county since Lexington County lacked a dedicated unit at the time, and their journey took hours due to rough dirt roads. When the bloodhounds arrived, the team provided them with an item carrying Helen's scent, a shirt from her boarding room still retaining a suitable odor for initial recognition. The bloodhounds began tracking from the boarding house area, closely following the familiar route toward the dirt road leading to the Congaree woods. At each fork or multi-trail spot, they paused briefly, sniffing the air and ground before proceeding in a specific direction. Their consistent behavior allowed the team to tentatively confirm that Helen likely followed her usual path before disappearing. As the bloodhounds moved deeper into the woods between the residential area and the site, previously assessed as the point of disappearance, they grew more attentive, slowing down and circling certain spots as if trying to distinguish a scent mixed with natural forest elements. This was deemed normal since the area had tall, dense trees, frequent animal traffic, wind-diluting odors, and constantly shifting dry leaves, making trail retention difficult. However, what caught the search team's attention was that, as the bloodhounds neared the road leading to the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, they began moving more decisively, locking onto one direction and pulling strongly toward an abandoned lumber storage area on the western edge of the site, where rotten planks, old wooden scaffolding pieces, and waste materials had been piled for months. The distinct scent trail in this direction prompted the team to pause and assess the possibility that Helen had passed through or stopped in this area before vanishing. They marked the spots where the bloodhounds reacted strongest, using flashlights and temporary wooden stakes for follow-up sweeping the next morning. However, during the preliminary check around the storage area, the search team found no new physical evidence or traces, no clear footprints, no drag marks, no displaced or recently disturbed objects. The dim flashlight beams, uneven terrain, and overlapping shadows prevented deeper inspection at night without risking scene contamination or team disorientation. One deputy suggested pushing the bloodhounds deeper into the storage area for further direction, but the shift commander reminded that there were no specific grounds to expand the nighttime search, especially without physical evidence confirming Helen's presence there. Moreover, the storage area held unstable old materials prone to collapse, and moving in darkness risked injury to people and dogs alike. Thus, after completing the nighttime search round and noting the bloodhounds' reactions, the team concluded that, while the scent trail pointed toward the abandoned storage area, the certainty was insufficient to justify intensive checking that same night. Instead, they documented the entire sequence, sketched the positions where bloodhounds lingered longest, and planned to return the next morning for verification under natural light. Ending the nighttime search, the sheriff's office noted this was the first time in the investigation a signal potentially tied to Helen's route had emerged, though unclear. However, without specific physical evidence, no signs of disturbance, and no witnesses confirming Helen approached the storage area, the team still had to follow procedure, note it but not expand actions until new grounds arose. The nighttime search closed with a notable but unconfirmed point, leaving the entire case suspended between potential progress and risk of stalemate. Following the nighttime search with an unverified scent signal at the storage area, the sheriff's office entered the necessary but often time-consuming phase of every missing persons investigation of that era, eliminating false leads to refine remaining valuable directions. First was verifying reports received after news of Helen's disappearance spread in the community, including claims of seeing a young girl walking along the main road, calls about a dark green truck speeding that afternoon, and even one report alleging Helen was taken onto a small boat on the Congaree River. When cross-checking times, locations, and actual witness statements, most reports were eliminated for not matching the time Helen left her boarding room or for mismatched physical descriptions. Some came from people too far away to realistically have seen Helen. Others were based on speculation without specifics, like saw a young girl resembling Helen with a strange man, but no precise location. All were filed under false reports to avoid repetition in future reviews. Next was re-examining collected physical items: the pale fabric scrap, metal wire segment, and smudged paper piece. Under natural light inspection, the team determined the fabric was likely part of a construction rag, since the material resembled clothing but had unnatural cuts and frayed threads, typical of wood-wiping cloths. The metal wire was confirmed by a worker as possibly binding wire for scaffolding, matching length and end curvature to tools used for framing. The smudged paper was deemed low value since lettering was completely blurred, with no discernible characters for comparison, and similar scraps often blew into forest paths from a small market miles away. Though not fully ruled out, all three items lacked signs, elevating suspicion, and were temporarily categorized as not directly related. Then, the team revisited all open investigative threads: the dark green truck, absent worker Richard Paulson, strange man at the forest edge, and scent signal toward the storage area. Through eliminating false leads, the team realized many threads no longer held value. County green trucks all had clear schedules. The strange man at the edge lacked specific description for pursuit. Herd engines were coincidental since no vehicles were seen. As a result, the investigative catalog narrowed to threads awaiting more data rather than immediate expansion. This false lead elimination phase helped the team avoid misguided paths and focus better on remaining points, though without strong evidence for next actions. After completing the elimination of false leads and narrowing remaining investigative directions, the sheriff's office had to confront the reality that Helen's disappearance no longer had any significant progress to justify continued expansion. Efforts spanning weeks, from daytime searches, nighttime searches, evidence collection, witness screening, truck cross-checking to site, and riverside inspections, yielded no clear signs of Helen's presence or any criminal act along her route. Remaining threads were all in waiting mode. Richard Paulson still uncontactable, but with no evidence against him. The dark green truck unidentified, the bloodhound scent signal unverifiable by physical evidence, and the storage area showing no disturbance. As the case dragged on without results, sheriff's office resources dwindled sharply. Deputies initially assigned were reassigned to other cases due to rising county security needs, while core investigators returned to higher priority matters. Ongoing review meetings grew shorter, intervals between field checks lengthened, and personnel time allocated to Helen's case was significantly cut. In the context of limited 1965 investigative technology, lacking new information meant continued searching would yield no different outcomes, only wasting manpower and time. By late summer that year, the Helen Ward file was officially reclassified as non-active case per sheriff's office procedure, not fully closed but with all direct investigative activity suspended until new evidence, verified information, or valuable supplemental statements emerged. The file was archived in the county records cabinet with all initial physical evidence, scene reports, witness statements, and route diagrams. This suspension decision did not cause the case to be forgotten, but it marked the official point where the investigation lost its initial momentum and entered a prolonged waiting state. A characteristic outcome for traceless disappearances in the 1960s era, lacking advanced forensic analysis and support technology. In the years following the transfer of Helen Ward's case file to inactive status, the case gradually sank beneath the dust of hundreds of new incidents in Lexington County, and with the personnel changes across successive terms, the file was moved multiple times between different storage rooms. Each relocation occurred under conditions lacking a unified records management system, a characteristic of the 1960s and 1970s, causing documents to be stacked, reclassified, or bundled with unrelated missing persons cases. When the sheriff's office opened a new storage area in the early 1970s, Helen's file was transferred to the back shelves, along with unsolved cases from the previous 2 decades, leading to the file cover fading, the binder discoloring, and some pages tearing at the edges over time. By the end of that decade, when the county renovated the office again, the old storage was moved to an annex building, and Helen's file continued along that flow of relocation, this time with no one left who fully knew its origin and original organization. During handovers between records management teams, a portion of the materials, including several handwritten witness statements and a marked search route diagram, was noted as location unknown in the inventory review. It is highly likely they were lost among unlabeled boxes or mistakenly placed with damaged documents slated for disposal. This loss was not detected immediately because at that time, no one was responsible for reviewing inactive cases. They simply remained in storage until there was reason to reopen them. For many years, Helen's file saw no new investigative actions, no additional witnesses, no new reports, no evidence submissions. Even the victim's name was no longer mentioned in internal meetings after the original investigation team disbanded or transferred. In that era, reopening cold cases was rarely prioritized due to resource shortages, limitations in forensic technology, and the prevailing view that missing persons cases lasting many years had little chance of progress. Helen Ward became one of many names lying dormant on Lexington County's list of unsolved missing persons, a list that grew longer, rarely touched, and gradually became files that new generations of investigators were not even aware of. Nearly a decade after Helen's file was forgotten in storage, the name Richard Paulson, the only worker ever within the scope of investigation, but unreachable at the time of her disappearance, unexpectedly resurfaced, not in South Carolina, but in the records of the Miami Police Department in Florida, where he was arrested in the late 1970s for involvement in a particularly aggravated murder. The case began when a young woman living alone in the Little River area was discovered missing from her apartment one evening, after neighbors heard loud noises in the hallway, but no one witnessed anything directly. The victim's body was found 3 days later in a vacant lot near an abandoned construction site on the city's outskirts, crudely concealed under rubble and building materials. Miami investigators noted multiple signs at the scene, indicating the perpetrator had stalked the victim beforehand: shoe prints lingering repeatedly near the apartment door, hand smudges on the hallway railing, suggesting someone had hidden there for a period, and several residents in the complex reporting sightings of a strange man loitering in the hallway in the days before the victim vanished. When reviewing footage from nearby store cameras, simple motion-activated still image recorders of that era, police captured the figure of a tall, thin man wearing a dark hat, walking along the edge of the road toward the area where the body was later found. Through parallel tracing from physical evidence and witness reports, Richard Paulson's name emerged as a person of interest because he had worked seasonally at a lumber yard just a few blocks away and had previously been accused by former co-workers of stalking women in the workplace. When Miami police first approached Paulson, he appeared cooperative and denied any involvement, but when timelines were cross-checked, police determined Paulson had no clear alibi for the window when the victim was believed to have been attacked. After 2 days of continuous interrogation, Paulson began showing contradictions in his statements, especially when questioned about his reasons for being near the victim's complex. Ultimately, through a combination of circumstantial statements, scene analysis, and soil stains on Paulson's shoes matching the type at the body recovery site, Miami police arrested and charged him with first-degree murder. During the expanded investigation to establish Paulson's motive and modus operandi, Miami investigators noted a suspicious pattern of repeated behavior, stalking the victim for a period before striking, selecting remote or abandoned construction areas for attacks, and finally disposing of the body by concealing it under available on-site materials, a method indicating the perpetrator was familiar with construction environments and likely had experience in that field. Reports describing the attack behavior emphasized Paulson's meticulous preparation. Evidence showed the victim had been stalked for at least a week prior, the attack site had no witnesses, and the disposal location was near where Paulson had worked. Despite many similarities to missing persons cases in remote areas elsewhere, authorities in Florida at that time had no information about the Helen Ward case, and South Carolina was not notified of Paulson's arrest due to rudimentary interstate data sharing. Most federal data focused on drug cases and federal crimes, not intrastate murders like Paulson's. In the Miami file, Paulson was described as a reclusive man with little social interaction, living alone, frequently relocating over the years, taking temporary construction jobs, and often abandoning residences after just a few months. Notably, during background verification, Florida police discovered Paulson had left South Carolina right around the time of Helen's disappearance, but since Helen's file in Lexington County had gone inactive, this information was never forwarded to relevant authorities. The Miami investigation team had no reason to suspect or delve deeply into Paulson's past beyond their current case, and thus no documents linked his behavior in Florida to Helen Ward's mysterious disappearance a decade earlier. The attack pattern Paulson employed in Miami, silent stalking, targeting young women living alone, quick strikes, disposal in abandoned construction sites, bore significant similarities to what was speculated in Helen's disappearance, but this overlap went unrecognized at the time due to geographic distance, lack of federal file connections, and Helen's file having faded into obscurity. As a result, even though Paulson was convicted in Florida and recorded as a dangerous repeat offender, his prior history in South Carolina was never examined, and his name never reappeared in any reviews related to Helen Ward's disappearance. After his conviction in Miami, Richard Paulson was transferred to a state correctional facility in Florida, where his sentence, though severe, fell during a period when prisons across the United States were facing severe overcrowding. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, many states implemented policies to reduce sentence lengths for inmates with no history of disruption in prison or who were not considered direct threats in the custodial environment. Paulson, being quiet and low conflict while incarcerated, quickly qualified as cooperative and nonviolent during rehabilitation, and thus began being considered for overcrowding reduction programs. Although his record included first-degree murder, policies of that era allowed significant sentence reductions if inmates met rehabilitation criteria. This mechanism lacked the risk assessment systems of later decades and had virtually no criminal psychology profiling. As a result, after just over a decade served, Paulson was released far earlier than his original sentence, under minimal supervision conditions, no long-term monitoring required, no federal interstate case linking, and no re-examination of his pre-arrest travel history. Upon leaving Florida, Paulson faced no specific residency restrictions beyond reporting a temporary address immediately after release. With no federal records flagging his prior connection to a South Carolina missing persons case, Paulson easily registered to relocate back to his former familiar area. In the early 1980s, he returned to South Carolina, settling in a small town not far from Lexington County, where he could blend into the seasonal labor community and take construction jobs identical to those he had done before. Paulson's return was so quiet that no one in Lexington County realized the man who had been inexplicably absent during Helen Ward's disappearance and later convicted of murder in Miami was now living in the same area without any oversight. With no interstate record exchanges, no local officers informed of his reappearance, and Helen's file buried in storage, Paulson's name did not draw attention even once. For many years after release, Paulson continued existing as an anonymous worker, renting cheap rooms, working day labor, moving between small construction sites without leaving any trace in South Carolina's legal system. His unsupervised return to the community became one of the most serious but unrecognized failures in the decades-long saga surrounding Helen Ward's disappearance. In 1992, nearly 3 decades after Helen Ward vanished, and Richard Paulson quietly returned to South Carolina without any oversight, Lexington County once again faced a case that shocked the community. The body of a young woman named Mary Foster was discovered in an area just a few miles northwest of where Helen was last seen. Mary, 24 years old, and an employee at a small local store, disappeared after her evening shift, when she failed to return home and contacted no one. Her family reported her missing that same night, but it was 2 days later that a group of young men fishing in a tributary of Congaree Creek discovered her body, covered under layers of decaying leaves and wood debris in a remote area, very close to the trail leading into the forest where Helen was last sighted. The scene of Mary's case revealed a notable behavioral pattern that authorities at the time did not recognize as similar to the past. Mary's body was concealed crudely, not fully buried, but simply placed under available environmental materials, dry branches, old wood pieces, and thick fallen leaves common in the Congaree forest. This disposal method was not typical of random violent crimes, but often reflected a familiar pattern. The perpetrator exploiting the natural environment for quick concealment, without special tools, and without attempting to clean the scene. The forensic report at the time determined Mary had been attacked at a different location before being moved to the discovery site. And notably, her body showed multiple signs of prior stalking, no signs of home break-in or abduction from a public place. Mary's jacket found dozens of meters from the body, as if dropped or discarded during restraint, and no struggle marks at the primary scene. These details led local authorities to suspect Mary had been stalked for a short period before the attack, then taken to a remote area, very similar to cases involving victim selection and body transport. When examining the surrounding context, deputies noted that the area where Mary was found was not far from where Helen vanished in 1965, both within the same forested strip, extending to former abandoned construction sites, in sparsely visited land, with only a few trails used habitually by locals. However, due to the vast time gap in Helen's file having been scattered after multiple relocations, no one recognized this coincidence. No documents in the sheriff's office at that time mentioned Helen. Many younger deputies were unaware the 1965 disappearance even existed. Thus, the Mary Foster case was handled as an independent incident, unrelated to any old cases. When examining Mary's body, the medical examiner found no direct identifiers of the perpetrator. Some hair fibers and small fabric materials were collected, but in 1992, DNA analysis capabilities in South Carolina were very limited. Labs could mainly test blood types or compare large samples, not perform complex individual matching. Mitochondrial DNA was not yet widely used, and many tests required sending to out-of-state labs, done only for high-priority cases or when a clear suspect existed for comparison. In Mary's case, there was no specific suspect. Statements from friends, family, and coworkers yielded no one with clear motive. Some witnesses reported seeing a tall, thin man near the store parking lot on the evening Mary vanished, but the description was too vague to trace. Local police attempted cross-checking with area residents, but found no full matches. The scene report also noted shoe prints near the body, but the type was common among laborers. Thick rubber soles, typical for construction or warehouse work. This made narrowing suspects nearly impossible since hundreds in the area wore similar shoes. When the investigation team considered the direction the victim was transported to the scene, they concluded Mary was likely brought to the forest area by vehicle, as the body placement marks did not align with pedestrian trails. But no witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles entering the forest during the disappearance window, and there were no surveillance cameras to help identify one. Though these details suggested the perpetrator had experience accessing remote areas and knew the terrain well, the Mary Foster case produced no direct links to a suspect. All analysis stopped at possible, insufficient to expand investigation to any group. More importantly, no one thought to review old cases with similar patterns, as South Carolina then lacked behavioral review systems and certainly no database for cross-referencing cases decades apart. The Mary Foster case was assessed as inconclusive in the initial phase, but not immediately cold-cased. Evidence was stored but not sent for DNA analysis due to technological limitations, and no suspect for comparison. The investigation report simply noted Mary was attacked by a stalker, with a behavioral pattern showing preparation and a disposal site far from the abduction point. No one knew these descriptions matched almost exactly what happened in Helen Ward's 1965 case, and even less that Richard Paulson, then living as an anonymous worker just a few miles from the scene, had a Miami conviction with an identical attack pattern. But in 1992, with forensics unable to compare DNA, Helen's file forgotten, and Paulson's South Carolina history unknown, the Mary Foster case was added to the 1990s unsolved list without any past connections. Only many years later, as forensic technology advanced and forgotten files were reopened, did the eerie similarities between the two cases gradually emerge. But in 1992, everything remained unformed suspicion, and the Mary Foster case drifted into the same stalled orbit as Helen Ward's before it. In the late 1990s, after the Mary Foster case continued to stall, and the county's record storage system faced pressure for reform, Lexington County began considering the establishment of a unit dedicated to backlog cases. By 1998, the cold case unit was officially approved, operating with the goal of reviewing long unsolved files, including missing persons cases, murders with unknown perpetrators, and situations that lacked sufficient grounds for prosecution at the time. When the new team took over the list of unsolved cases, their authority expanded significantly due to the county's reinvestment in the database, and some files thought to have been forgotten for decades suddenly reappeared in the catalog. Among them, the name Helen Ward, missing 1965, emerged as a case needing re-evaluation, not because of new leads, but because the file contained many gaps due to the limitations of the investigative force at the time and the prolonged storage process that had fragmented the data. The cold case unit decided to place the Helen case in the medium priority group, alongside cases with recovered bodies but no suspects, to gauge how much information could be reconstructed before committing greater resources. During the 1998-1999 period, the unit's first action was to collect all remaining files related to Helen, including scattered typed reports from 1965, handwritten notes from the night deputy, witness lists, sketched maps of Helen's usual route, and evidence logs that had been transferred through multiple storage locations. Gathering all these documents took many months because some were stored in the old sheriff's office warehouse, others in the old evidence vault at the courthouse, and the rest mixed into unlabeled boxes of files from the 1970s that had been relocated without proper sorting. Some documents regarding initial witness statements were missing, but the cold case unit still obtained a substantial amount of information sufficient to reconstruct the overall picture. During the preliminary review, they paid particular attention to two factors. The area where Helen vanished was very close to where Mary Foster's body was found in 1992, and the recurring mentions of the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber construction site, which had been considered only a suspect location but never thoroughly cross-checked with personnel data from that time. However, at this stage, the cold case unit did not delve deeply into connections and focused solely on the task of re-establishing the original file, cross-referencing all remaining records, cataloging evidence never analyzed, backing up all documents at risk of deterioration, and eliminating gaps caused by improper storage over decades. By the end of 1999, a newly reconstructed file was formed, more complete and systematic than at any point since 1965. Although no breakthrough had been achieved, the cold case unit concluded that the Helen Ward case needed to move to the in-depth analysis phase in 2000, when the county began applying more modern investigative methods and had the ability to coordinate data with cases in other states. This was the first time in decades that the 1965 disappearance had a chance to be reconsidered as a solvable case, rather than a mystery abandoned to time. When the cold case unit officially entered the focused analysis phase in early 2000, the entire file related to Helen Ward was handed over to investigator Thomas Avery, a recent addition to the unit with extensive experience in crime scene analysis and criminal behavior reconstruction. Upon receiving the thickened file from the prior consolidation process, Avery spent many weeks simply reading all the documents from start to finish, without skipping any minor detail, with the goal of re-evaluating the entire process according to 2000 investigative standards, at a time when investigative techniques, witness handling, search scope methods, and risk assessment models were completely different from 1965. From the very first pages, Avery identified the first major error. The 1965 disappearance of Helen had been classified as likely to return on her own, causing the initial police response to be slower than necessary. By 2000 standards, a young student vanishing while walking alone through an area of forest mixed with construction sites should have been assessed as a high-risk situation immediately, especially since the Congaree area at that time still had many undeveloped lands and temporary construction zones. In the 1965 file, there was no evidence that police had cordoned off the last known location within the first 24 hours, a critical window that, according to Avery, could have caused them to miss many scene traces easily erased by nighttime rain, passers-by, or construction activity. The second error Avery identified was that the search of the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site stopped at interviewing workers present that day, with no records of deeper checks in the old storage area, under flooring, material pits, or areas that could conceal traces. Additionally, the file showed no cross-referencing between the worker list and county residency data, a key step that could have uncovered unusual absences like Richard Paulson's, but it was buried in scattered notes. The third error was the non-standardized recording of witness statements. Many descriptions of a green truck, a strange man, or a loud engine were noted briefly, without comparisons, without determining observation angles, without estimating distances, and without position sketches. By 2000 standards, such details required grid-style scene diagrams, line-of-sight verification, and grouping statements by match potential. In the 1965 file, everything was fragmented. The fourth error Avery noted was that initial evidence, the pale-colored fabric scrap, thin metal wire, smudged paper fragment, was sealed relatively haphazardly by current standards, old paper bags without clear date-time markings, and no continuous chain of custody. Though this could not fully blame the era's force, it made reanalysis more difficult. However, what concerned Avery most was the geographic overlap between where Helen vanished and where Mary Foster's body was discovered in 1992. When comparing the site maps of both cases, he realized that the intersection between Helen's route and the road where Mary was found was separated only by a not too wide stretch of forest, and in criminal patterns, such overlaps are rarely random coincidence. With this series of errors and omissions, Avery quickly decided the investigative logic needed to be reconstructed from scratch, based on 2000 standards, rather than the 1965 sequence. He reviewed all timelines, redetermined the last scene point by eliminating segments of the route, remapped the network of high-risk areas, listed locations overlooked in 1965, and prioritized them anew. Simultaneously, Avery compiled a summary table of all recorded witnesses, marking statements that could be reconstructed, those unverifiable, and witnesses potentially still alive in 2000 for re-interview consideration. Upon completing the initial assessment, Avery concluded that the Helen case was not lacking clues as previously thought, but rather the initial handling had caused potential connections to be overlooked. Therefore, his next step was to reconstruct the entire process by eliminating outdated sequencing, grouping the most critical leads into a new logical chain, and preparing to pursue checks that 1965 lacked the capability for, especially those related to construction personnel and individuals living near the Congaree area. No detail, however small, was allowed to be overlooked. Avery saw his task as putting the case back on the track it should have been on 35 years earlier. After completing the full re-evaluation of the file and identifying key errors in the original investigation, Avery immediately began reconstructing the time-space workflow, viewing it as the most critical foundation for understanding exactly when, where, and in what direction Helen disappeared. His first step was to reuse Lexington County topographic maps from 1964-1966, including dirt road maps, construction zone divisions, and Congaree forest diagrams from before modern planning. Avery aimed to accurately recreate the environment Helen had walked through, knowing that a pedestrian victim in the afternoon of 1965 would be directly affected by natural light levels, sparse road structures, distances between homes and construction sites, and roadside forest cover. From the old maps, Avery reconstructed Helen's usual walking route, including side paths not detailed in 1965 records. He gathered additional county archived images, planning documents, Lexington Scaffold and Lumber construction records, and archived maps from the South Carolina Department of Transportation to pinpoint the routes pedestrians of that era might choose. Next, Avery applied light simulation. He looked up sunset time on the disappearance day, calculated how quickly darkness increased in dense canopy forest sections, thereby identifying points where Helen could lose visibility from the main road in minutes. This simulation allowed him to assess not only Helen's route, but also potential approach paths for an offender without detection. Avery then used topographic drawings to identify the highest probability access points, locations where an attacker could emerge suddenly without the victim having time to react. As he examined each road segment, he noted one particularly noteworthy area, the narrow dirt road along the edge of the Lexington Scaffold and Lumber site, with only a few wooden poles, abandoned corrugated roofing, and material piles obstructing views. This was the intersection between Helen's walking route and the area where Paulson worked in 1965. Information Avery confirmed from the worker list in the construction file. When Avery overlaid these two data sets on the map, a significant connection emerged. If Helen followed her usual route, she would pass directly through the area Paulson could observe from his work position or material collection points. Avery continued cross-referencing the time Helen left her boarding house, the time the last witness saw her heading toward the construction area, and when her roommate realized she hadn't returned. Combining dwindling light, reasonable walking distance, and the vanishing point adjacent to the site, Avery concluded the highest probability access point was the forest edge bordering the old material area, where an attacker could pull a victim inside in seconds without detection from the main road. From this model, Avery expanded analysis by re-examining all 1965 construction worker data. He immediately noted Richard Paulson, absent during initial investigation, with flexible work hours and assigned to the border area along Helen's route. Overlaying this on the simulation map revealed overlap between where Paulson could stand, Helen's path, and the obscured intersection under tree canopy. All this did not prove anything immediately, but created a logical structure never previously established. From there, Avery marked the access area on a new map, saving layers for light, position, time, and observation range, making it the centerpiece of the entire reconstruction. That model would become a key tool for linking two seemingly unrelated points: Helen's 1965 disappearance and a 1992 body discovery not far away. And above all, it placed Paulson for the first time in 35 years firmly within the scope of serious re-examination. After completing the space-time model and identifying the access area with the highest probability, Avery moved on to the next critical step, tracing the list of workers employed at Lexington Scaffold and Lumber in 1965, a document that the original investigation team had only noted sporadically and never fully archived. With the help of the county archives and old labor tax records, Avery obtained for the first time a complete list of all workers at the time of Helen's disappearance, including seasonal personnel, short-term laborers, and shift crews that had previously not been cross-referenced. While examining the list by date, Avery noticed something that the 1965 team had only briefly noted but never investigated in depth: Richard Paulson, a young worker assigned to the area bordering the forest, the only one marked absent without reason on the exact day Helen vanished. This point became even more noteworthy when Avery cross-checked the work shifts of the other workers and realized that everyone else had signed timesheets or presence records, while Paulson showed no sign of appearing at the construction site from the afternoon onward. Avery continued digging deeper by reviewing the parent company's personnel data, cross-referencing Paulson's name with state tax files, and discovering that he left South Carolina just a few months after Helen's disappearance. This was also the period when Paulson left no registration or residency information in the county, a detail no one noticed in 1965 due to the lack of interstate movement tracking systems. To strengthen his analysis, Avery began placing Paulson's name on the criminal timeline he had built. When connecting data from the Miami records, he recognized a pattern that made the results even more suspicious. Paulson had previously committed crimes involving stalking victims from a distance, choosing approach times in areas with limited visibility, attacking quickly, and disposing of evidence in remote locations, a pattern that significantly matched the area where Helen's trail ended according to the simulated map. Paulson's disappearance from South Carolina after the incident further aligned with the typical movement pattern of opportunistic criminals when the area became hot or risked linking them to the crime. Avery continued reviewing the 1992 Mary Foster records and realized that the location where the body was found, that time fell within the travel range where Paulson had lived upon returning to South Carolina after his release. Although no conclusion could yet be drawn, this overlap meant that Paulson's name was no longer just a vague detail, as in the original files. When overlaying the 3 layers of data in one system, absence on the day of the disappearance, later criminal pattern, and geographic connection between the 2 cases, nearly 3 decades apart, Avery determined that Paulson had to be placed on the list of top potential suspects for the first time in 35 years, based on properly cross-referenced data. From there, he created a separate analysis profile for Paulson, separating him from the rest of the workers to prepare for a deeper evaluation of his behavior, movements, and criminal history, something impossible in 1965. After retrieving the 1965 worker list and placing Paulson in the core suspect group, Avery moved to the most critical phase of the reinvestigation process, reanalyzing all the physical evidence collected in the year of Helen's disappearance, which had been poorly sealed by 1960s standards, but was still viable for applying 2000-era DNA technology and forensic cross-matching. The first step was to inventory the remaining evidence in storage, including a pale-colored fabric scrap found near the forest entrance in Congaree, a small piece of metal wire recovered near the construction area, and especially a hair strand discovered stuck to a smudged piece of paper that previously no one considered valuable evidence due to the lack of analysis technology. Avery sent all the evidence to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's forensic lab, requesting priority analysis of the hair using mtDNA technique, a type of mitochondrial DNA, particularly useful in cold cases because it doesn't require the root and can still be matched maternally. After weeks of waiting, the report came back and made Avery pause for a long time. The mtDNA sequence from the hair recovered at the scene perfectly matched the maternal line DNA sample in Richard Paulson's records, obtained indirectly from his Miami criminal file, which stored genetic information from many defendants for long-term cross-matching. While mtDNA cannot identify a specific individual with 100% certainty, the maternal line match made Paulson the only suspect on the list who could potentially fit the biological evidence collected where Helen's trail ended. Avery immediately requested expanded analysis on the other evidence items, particularly the pale fabric scrap found on the turnoff leading into the forest. Using spectroscopy and fiber comparison, the lab determined that the scrap was cut from a type of light gray work shirt produced by an industrial supplier in Georgia in the mid-1960s. This result perfectly corresponded with information Avery had gathered from Lexington Scaffold and Lumber's personnel records. The company had ordered worker uniforms for scaffolding crews in exactly that fabric and color during 1964-1966. When cross-referencing the worker list, Avery discovered that only a specific department was issued this uniform type, the crew working near the forest border, which included Paulson. The torn fabric at the disappearance site suggested the possibility of a struggle or at least physical contact between the victim and someone wearing construction uniforms. But the most crucial detail came from the final evidence item, the thin metal wire segment found near the intersection of the trail and the old materials area. With 1965 technology, the wire was simply recorded as an object of unknown origin, but Avery sent it to SLED's Materials Analysis Unit for composition determination and comparison with industrial tools. The results showed the segment was scaffolding tie wire used to secure bracing bars and temporary materials. When Avery compared this sample to the tools supplied to Lexington Scaffold and Lumber workers, he found an unexpected match. The wire had the same gauge, twist pattern, and oxidation level as the type listed in the inventory issued to the Forest Border crew in the months before Helen's disappearance. More importantly, in the 1965 tool allocation ledger from the company's tool shed, a document Avery only located after weeks of searching, Paulson was one of the few workers assigned this specific tie wire because he was on the team responsible for temporary scaffolding setup. When Avery cross-referenced the evidence items simultaneously, mtDNA from the hair, the uniform fabric scrap, and the scaffolding tie wire, a picture began to emerge clearly. All three pieces of evidence from three different locations around where Helen's trail ended, linked to the same group of individuals, with Paulson standing out prominently throughout. Combined, they formed a chain of evidence stronger than anything the case had in its 35 years. Although Avery understood that each item alone could not prove anything conclusive, their simultaneous match to materials, biology, and tools associated with Paulson was something the 1965 investigation had no chance of recognizing. From there, Avery created a comprehensive analysis table identifying where each evidence item was found, its relevance to assault behavior, and the likelihood it was dropped during victim approach. When connecting this data to the previously built space-time model, he saw everything aligned to an alarming degree. The fabric location was exactly the highest risk approach point. The wire appeared where an attacker could drag a victim unseen, and the hair was in the intersection between the trail and the construction turnoff, a spot only someone familiar with the terrain would choose as a path. With all the forensic data reanalyzed to 2000 standards, Avery concluded that the evidence chain was no longer just scattered fragments, as in 1965, but had become the most important foundation bringing Richard Paulson closer than ever to the position of prime suspect in Helen Ward's disappearance. As the evidence increasingly converged on Paulson, Avery decided to expand the document search to Florida, aiming to review all personal records seized when Paulson was arrested in Miami. These documents, mostly stored in the Miami-Dade Police Department archives, had been classified as not directly relevant to the Florida case and thus never transferred to South Carolina. Avery submitted a formal request through the Cold Case Unit, and after nearly 2 months of coordination, Miami sent Lexington County a sealed box of documents, including personal papers, correspondence, items seized from his rental room, and some handwritten notes not clearly listed in the original report. Among those items, Avery immediately noticed a thin brown-covered notebook, its pages yellowed with age, with no markings on the outside, but showing signs of use over many years. When opening it, he saw that the pages were not written continuously, but scattered across different periods, sometimes just a few lines, sometimes symbols or cryptic numbers. Most content was in short notes, not a daily diary, but more like a catalog of timestamps and events. Some pages had backdated entries, others had no dates, but shared similar symbols. Avery realized the notebook was not for everyday journaling, but a personal coded system for marking events, common among criminals with repeating behavioral cycles. Flipping to the middle section, Avery came across the notation, 2.65 inches, written in faded blue ink, followed by a brief line, "B girl, forest edge, sudden route shift." No name, no location, no detailed description, but this entry appeared in the exact month of Helen's disappearance. The B took Avery a long time to interpret. When reviewing the entire notebook, he discovered repeating letters, A, B, F, men. but not in alphabetical order. After hours reviewing Paulson's Florida assault records, he identified a pattern. Each letter did not represent a victim's name, but an approach route. A was often linked to coastal residential areas. F appeared in pages describing areas near Florida scrapyards where Paulson had attacked a woman, and B showed up in notes related to forests or trails. What drew Avery's stronger attention was the phrase, forest edge, sudden route shift. When cross-referencing it with Helen's space-time model, Avery realized forest edge and sudden route shift described almost exactly the section where Helen turned into the construction area before vanishing, where the path narrowed, light diminished, and visibility was obstructed. Though not direct evidence, Paulson noting an event in that exact month and terrain type became even more significant when Avery turned to later pages. Near the end of the notebook, there was an entry marked with an X, below which read Miami, success, full silence. Florida specialists had told Avery that Paulson had a habit of marking milestones after each attack, often described with a single keyword. Comparing the structure of Florida-related entries to the 1965 ones, Avery recognized identical writing style, concise, coded, avoiding real names or specific locations. This created a logical chain for the notebook. It not only listed attacks, but described them in a personal coded format about place, approach, and outcome. When Avery flipped back to earlier pages, he found another line, 165, B zone, attempt failed. Walked away. This entry, with double question marks, indicated Paulson had approached a target in the same B zone early in 1965, but did not complete the act. There was no evidence linking that event to Helen, but it reinforced the pattern that Paulson had been active in the same area for months, matching his employment period at Lexington Scaffold and Lumber. When Avery plotted all the 1965-1992 notes on a timeline, including both Helen's and Mary Foster's cases, one thing became clear. Paulson used a consistent coding structure over nearly 3 decades, recording each attack in the same style, and the event timed with Helen fell right in the middle of his long criminal sequence. This level of alignment made Avery realize for the first time that the notebook might be the missing piece. The case had waited 35 years. For though it did not name Helen, when placed alongside the mtDNA results, scene evidence, reconstructed location model, and Paulson's absence on the day she vanished, the notebook created a seamless chain linking criminal milestones from 1965 to 1992. A suspect once vague in the old files now became the focal point of the entire restarted investigation. Avery immediately digitized every page, created 3 backups, and marked the notebook as the most important evidence since the case reopened. A small, yellowed, faded ink notebook powerful enough to connect a forgotten past to a present where Paulson's secrets were gradually being revealed. With the new data chain complete, Avery prepared for the interrogation phase with Paulson by compiling all the evidence, mtDNA from the hair, reanalyzed physical items, the space-time model, and especially the notebook seized from the Miami records, to build a set of questions capable of forcing Paulson to confront contradictions from 1965 that had never been raised before. When Avery and a cold case unit investigator arrived at the Florida State Prison, Paulson appeared calm, as if the meeting was just routine related to old records. He had no idea that the new data had entirely restructured the case to point directly at him. Avery started with neutral questions about Paulson's time working at Lexington Scaffold and Lumber, his shift schedules, the characteristics of the area he was assigned to, and the reason he left South Carolina right after the summer of 1965. Initially, Paulson answered smoothly, repeating the story he had given years earlier, that he quit because he didn't get along with management, that he didn't remember exactly when he left, and that he never interacted with any students passing the construction site. However, when Avery presented the 1965 worker list he had first retrieved from the archives and pointed to the entry marked absent without reason on the day Helen vanished, Paulson's expression changed slightly, a fleeting moment, but enough for Avery to notice the tension in his reaction. Paulson immediately claimed he was definitely there that day but didn't sign because the supervisor missed it. When Avery asked for the supervisor's name to cross-check, Paulson gave one that appeared in no records anywhere. That was the first contradiction. Avery then moved to the pale fabric scrap. He made no accusations, just asked, "Did your company in 1965 issue this type of light gray shirt?" Paulson said there was no specific uniform, but Avery had the uniform ledger from the site's accounting department. The second contradiction formed immediately. Next, Avery brought up the scaffolding tie wire. Paulson insisted every worker used that kind of wire, but Avery showed the tool distribution record proving only the forest border crew was issued that specific type, with Paulson's name on the list. Upon hearing that, Paulson started hedging, saying he didn't remember exactly, it was too long ago, it couldn't be verified. Each response showed confusion not seen in his Miami interrogations. But the pivotal moment came when Avery placed the notebook on the table, open to the page with 265, B girl, forest edge, sudden root shift. This time Paulson stared at the page, then said he didn't remember writing anything, and that it was just meaningless symbols. Avery asked why this notation matched the exact month of Helen's disappearance, why forest edge fit the location model, and why the same B-zone symbol appeared in notes for crimes Paulson was convicted of in Miami. Paulson did not answer directly, instead shifting to talk about religion and the symbolic meaning of the notations. When Avery pressed further on why he left South Carolina right after February 1965, Paulson said he followed a spiritual calling, a vague explanation absent from any prior official statements. The contradictions between the data and his statements caused Paulson to increasingly lose control of his responses. He denied each detail, but the denials contradicted his previous answers, especially when Avery asked if he had ever seen Helen. At that point, Paulson paused for several seconds, said he might have seen someone passing by, then immediately denied it. Don't remember the face, don't remember the time. Contradictions continued to pile up. Avery did not apply direct pressure. Instead, he simply noted each reaction and shift in demeanor. The interrogation ended after many hours, and though Paulson did not confess, the contradictions in his statements were enough for Avery to conclude that Paulson no longer fit the role of unrelated person, as the old records had determined. From there, Avery prepared an internal report, created a detailed comparison table between evidence and statements, and marked the interrogation as the official turning point, bringing the case to a stage where legal action against Paulson could be considered, something that had never had a chance in the previous 35 years. After the interrogation in Florida and the unexplained contradictions in Paulson's statement, Avery decided that the next step had to take place right in Lexington County, specifically the area of the old Lexington Scaffold and Lumber Yard, where the space-time model, physical evidence, and labor records all pointed to the highest probability access point in Helen's disappearance. The site's footprint had changed over the decades, the old structures had been demolished, part of the land leveled, and the piles of materials from years past were gone. But Avery knew that surface changes could not completely erase traces that once existed deep beneath the soil. He coordinated with the county's specialized search team and 2 cadaver dog units, dogs trained to detect signs of biological decomposition that had persisted for many years, and established a search perimeter encompassing the entire lumberyard area with particular focus on the zone outlined in the access model Avery had built from 1965 data. As soon as the dogs began moving across the land bordering the forest, their reactions indicated that this area had never been properly surveyed before. One of the 2 cadaver dogs repeatedly stopped in the ground near where temporary scaffolding had once stood, just a few dozen steps from the route Helen used to take. At first, Avery thought this might be a response to wildlife remains, common on the edge of Congaree forest, but when both dogs reacted strongly at the same spot, after 3 passes from different directions, Avery noted it as an area requiring deeper examination. To avoid bias, the search team expanded the perimeter by a few meters in a fan pattern. The results remained the same. The cadaver dogs consistently marked a slightly depressed area of ground directly behind the old materials shed, where company records confirmed there had once been a staging yard for scaffolding ropes and metal bars. The forensics team began using ground probing tools to check soil compaction and stratigraphy. Almost immediately, they noted an anomaly. The soil in that area was harder than the surrounding ground, forming a compacted layer in an unnatural shape. The preliminary report showed compaction extending 40 to 60 centimeters deep, the depth consistent with a small burial pit or temporary disposal site filled in during the 1960s. Avery ordered continued testing, using core drilling, extracting vertical soil columns, and sealing them in evidence bags. When the samples were taken to the temporary lab, the field analysis team conducted tests for long-term organic decomposition compounds. The results revealed the presence of low but abnormal levels of certain microbial markers, including compounds typically produced during the decay of human or animal soft tissue that remained stable under old soil layers for extended periods. Although these findings were not sufficient to confirm that a body had been buried there, the distribution of the compounds was uneven across the area and concentrated precisely at the spot the cadaver dogs had initially marked. As Avery examined the subsequent samples, he noticed discoloration streaks in the soil. The top layer showed high mixing, but the lower layer displayed disturbed stratification characteristic of ground that had been excavated and refilled rather than formed naturally. This disturbance fell exactly within the depth range achievable by manual digging, especially if done hastily or under cover of late afternoon. To strengthen the findings, Avery directed the survey team to extend checks another 3 meters to the side. No anomalies appeared in the expanded area, further supporting the hypothesis that the spot the cadaver dogs reacted to was the only location likely to have once contained decomposing organic material. According to 1965 records, this plot was not an industrial waste burial site, ruling out contamination from construction materials. Moreover, site plans showed the location had once been obscured by 2 large plywood sheets and scaffolding, making it an ideal spot for someone on the crew to temporarily dispose of an object without being seen. Avery prepared the scene report, documenting all findings, photographing the area from multiple angles, and submitting the remaining soil samples for advanced analysis. Although no remains were recovered, the signs of soil compaction, the presence of long-term organic decomposition compounds, and the repeated cadaver dog alerts created a direct connection, something that had never emerged in any prior search effort. When combined with the chain of physical evidence and the contradictions in Paulson's statements, the old lumber yard became the foundation for Avery to assert that this was the central location requiring further legal steps, as after 35 years, the scene had finally yielded clear signals. Once all the data, from soil analysis and cadaver dog alerts to the chain of evidence, was compiled into a complete report, Avery realized the moment to apply direct pressure had arrived. He prepared to re-interview Paulson, no longer to test his statement, but to confront him with undeniable facts. The meeting took place in an interrogation room at Florida State Prison, where Paulson was serving his sentence. Avery brought the new scene map, photos of the abnormally compacted ground, lab results, and the list of contradictions from the prior session. From the start, Avery asked no questions. He simply placed the photo of the old lumber yard in front of Paulson and said, "We know where it started." Silence lasted nearly a minute. Paulson looked at the photo, the map, then back at the investigator. As Avery proceeded to lay out each detail, EP DNA, the fabric scrap, the scaffolding tie wire, the notebook, and finally the report on the decomposition-marked ground, Paulson leaned back in his chair, no longer denying outright as before but closing his eyes, breathing faster than usual. When Avery opened the notebook to the page 265, B Girl, Forest Edge, Paulson's expression changed completely. He no longer tried to deny or offer religious or vague explanations. After a long pause, Paulson said quietly, "I knew she passed the site every afternoon." From that statement, Avery understood the final wall of silence had begun to crack. Paulson continued in an even but heavy voice. He had watched Helen for weeks as she walked along the forest edge, chose a day when the site was quieter than usual, and left work early without telling anyone. He admitted approaching Helen from behind on a section of trail obscured from view, saying it happened faster than I thought. He dragged her between two temporary plywood sheets behind the materials shed, where sound would not easily reach the main road. When Avery asked why, Paulson did not answer directly, only saying, "Because I knew I could, and no one would see." He admitted assaulting Helen, saying she fought back more than he expected, tearing his work shirt, a detail that perfectly matched the faded fabric scrap recovered in 1965. When Avery moved to questions about disposal, Paulson admitted filling in an old hole behind the lumber shed that had previously been used for construction debris. He described the area as having two wooden stakes crossed over each other, and that he dragged Helen's body there as dusk approached. This detail aligned with the compacted soil location marked by the cadaver dogs. However, when Avery pressed for the exact spot, Paulson said he couldn't remember every step because the area was cluttered with materials at the time, and the ground had changed many times over the years. Paulson tried to describe the direction from the trail turn left, a few dozen steps near the lower ground, but the level of detail was insufficient for pinpointing an exact burial site, and Avery knew this was normal for a disposal carried out 35 years earlier, especially with repeated surface alterations. Though he could not draw a complete diagram, Paulson still confirmed he had filled the hole within the old lumber yard, in the range where the cadaver dogs had reacted. When Avery asked if he had ever returned to the area afterward, Paulson was silent for a long time, then simply said, "No. I avoided South Carolina because I knew if I went back, it would remind me." The interrogation ended with a confession incomplete regarding the precise location, but complete regarding the approach, assault, and disposal of Helen. What Paulson had just admitted, combined with the physical evidence, terrain data, and notebook entries, formed the final piece in the prosecution structure, opening a legal door that for decades no one thought reachable. Following Paulson's confession, Avery immediately returned to Lexington County to finalize the prosecution file, assembling every piece of evidence accumulated over years of reinvestigation. The first report he drafted was a side-by-side comparison of evidence and confession, placing each admitted detail alongside independent data, maternal line mtDNA match from hair recovered at the scene, faded fabric scrap consistent with the uniform type worn by Lexington Scaffold and Lumber workers, metal tie wire matching the type issued to the crew working near the forest edge, compacted soil, with long-term organic decomposition markers located exactly where Paulson described refilling a hole. Next, Avery attached full copies of Paulson's notebook, annotating each entry to reveal the encoded pattern of repeated behavior from 1965 to 1992. With the note, 265, B girl, forest edge, sudden route shift, aligning almost perfectly with Helen's disappearance circumstances. He also included the space-time model map, cross-referencing the last sighting of Helen with Paulson's work location and the approach direction consistent with the confession. Another key part of the prosecution file was the soil samples from the old lumber yard. Avery included the chemical biological analysis results showing long-term organic decomposition compounds, along with reports of consistent reactions from two independent cadaver dog teams. Although Helen's remains were not recovered, the report demonstrated artificial soil disturbance characteristic of a disposal pit. To tighten the case, Avery added full records of contradictions in Paulson's statements, denying ownership of a uniform yet final records proving otherwise, denying use of tie wires yet allocation lists, showing he received them, denying absence on the day Helen vanished, yet timesheets proving he was the only one missing, offering reasons for leaving South Carolina that matched no prior documentation. Each contradiction was placed beside corresponding evidence, forming an inescapable logical chain ruling out innocence. Avery also included the formal confession summary, covering Paulson's admission of approaching Helen from behind, dragging her into the abandoned scaffolding area and refilling an old hole to conceal the body. Though no exact location was specified, the confession was cross-referenced with the compacted soil site and scene model, matching closely enough to establish legal grounds for charges. After completing all documents, Avery presented the file to the Lexington County prosecutor. The meeting lasted hours, during which the prosecutor reviewed each evidence source, assessing standards required for charging in a no-body case, a significant challenge, but here strengthened by the confession and multi-layered evidence. The prosecutor concluded the file was strong enough to proceed to the next legal step, issuing a formal arrest warrant for Richard Paulson on charges of first-degree murder and concealment of a body. Following the meeting, the warrant draft was prepared the same day, citing all grounds: maternal line mitochondrial DNA match, encoded journal entries aligning with timing and attack method, soil samples showing long-term organic decomposition in the area, Paulson described, confession detailing approach and assault, plus comparison to later Florida crimes, establishing a repeated behavioral pattern. When the judge signed the warrant, Lexington County finally possessed what it had lacked for 35 years: complete legal grounds based on modern technology and the integration of physical evidence, statements, and behavioral analysis. The warrant was immediately forwarded to the Florida Department of Corrections, marking the moment the long-forgotten case was brought back into the light as a fully developed criminal file, ready for prosecution after more than 3 decades gathering dust. The trial of Richard Paulson took place in early 2001 at the Lexington County Courthouse, a proceeding that drew particular attention because it not only addressed a murder from 1965, but also served as a test case for an entire cold case investigation, reconstructed using modern forensic technology. From the very first day, the prosecutor presented the case structure in 2 parts: the original investigation limited by the constraints of its era and the new investigation based on 2000 standards. The jury heard about the 1965 context, when USC student Helen Ward went missing while walking near the Congaree forest. The case was assessed as low risk with no large-scale search conducted in the critical first 24 hours, resulting in important evidence being missed. The prosecutor emphasized that the investigators at the time could not reach any conclusions due to the lack of DNA technology, lack of standardized statement recording, lack of federal data linkage, and lack of construction personnel lookup systems. To help the jury understand the difference between the 2 phases, the prosecution presented a summary of the errors identified by Avery: failure to secure the last seen point, failure to thoroughly search the construction site, failure to cross-check timesheets, failure to categorize statements by route, and failure to apply any risk assessment methods to the forest-adjacent area. However, the centerpiece of the trial lay in the new investigation, where forensic technology and terrain reconstruction formed the foundation of the charges. Avery was called to the witness stand and detailed the space-time model, the 1965 terrain map, sunset position, sightline obstructions, and the daily route Helen used. He explained why the forest section bordering the old materials yard was the highest probability access point, not based on speculation, but on analysis of lighting, road structure, witness accounts, and the presence of workers in the area. When the prosecution introduced the map, the jury could see the trail where Helen was last seen and the location of the lumber yard where Paulson worked. Next, the physical evidence was presented in groups: biological, material, and stratigraphic. The SLED lab confirmed that mtDNA from a hair found in 1965 matched Paulson's maternal line, which the prosecutor clearly explained does not identify an individual, absolutely, but narrows the scope to the maternal family. And in this case, only Paulson fell into that group. A textile analyst described the faded fabric fragment, once dismissed as worthless, that matched the exact type of scaffolding worker uniform ordered by Lexington Scaffold Lumber between 1964 and 1966. The prosecutor particularly emphasized that only the crew adjacent to the forest received that type of shirt, and Paulson was on that list. Regarding the metal wire segment, the materials analyst presented it as a rare type of scaffolding tie wire with limited distribution, and Paulson had been issued corresponding tools. These details not only showed evidence consistent with the suspect, but also pointed to the crime scene location, the construction site, exactly where Avery's model identified as the access point. Moving to the stratigraphic group, the prosecution introduced the report on the anomalously compacted area. Soil samples from the old lumberyard contained evidence of long-term organic decomposition, cadaver dog alerts at that exact spot, and soil disturbance patterns consistent with digging and refilling a pit, perfectly matching the description Paulson gave in his confession. The third part of the trial was the confession, considered the pivotal element. The prosecution played the audio recording of Paulson's admission, in which he stated he had stalked Helen for weeks, approached her at the forest edge, dragged her behind the materials yard, struggled with her, causing her shirt to tear, and used an old pit to dispose of the body. Paulson admitted he did not remember the exact location, but described two crossed wooden stakes that matched the spot where cadaver dogs reacted and also matched the old site diagram. The prosecutor pointed out that the confession could not be dismissed as mistaken because the details about terrain, scaffolding structures, and pit location were not public information. Only someone who had worked and been there in 1965 would know them. Faced with this evidence, Paulson's defense attorney argued that the case lacked a body, that the notebook markings proved nothing, and that Paulson's memory of an event 35 years earlier might be unreliable. However, the prosecution countered by comparing the notebook entries to the criminal behavior in Florida and the Mary Foster case. All shared the same encoding pattern, showing it was not random symbols, but a behavioral log. The notebook was projected on screen for the jury, and the prosecutor explained the coded structure: B-zone, forest edge, rote shift, phrases that matched the location where Helen disappeared. Finally, the prosecutor synthesized all the data into a logical chain. Paulson was absent on the day Helen vanished. Physical evidence matched him. DNA matched the maternal line. Notebook entries matched the timeline. The site model pointed to the lumber yard where he worked. The soil there showed long-term decomposition, and his own confession confirmed the act. The prosecutor concluded that although Helen's body had never been found, the entire evidentiary system, from physical evidence, space-time modeling, behavioral analysis, construction site cross-checking, forensic data, to the confession, created a unified picture. Richard Paulson was the person who assaulted and killed Helen Ward in February 1965. After the closing arguments, the jury was asked to consider whether that chain of evidence met the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial lasted many weeks, but when they entered deliberations, it took them less than a full day to reach a verdict. In a packed courtroom, the jury returned to their seats, and the foreperson stood to read the decision. Richard Paulson was guilty of first-degree murder in the disappearance of Helen Ward. That verdict not only closed a case that had spanned more than 3 decades, but also created profound repercussions within South Carolina's law enforcement system, forcing agencies to re-examine how they had handled adult missing persons cases in previous decades. In the post-trial debrief meetings in 2001, Lexington County leadership candidly assessed that the Helen Ward case exposed a serious weakness. The outdated mindset that most missing adults would return on their own had made the initial 1965 investigation slow, missing the golden window for evidence collection. Helen's case became a textbook example of the long-term consequences of failing to activate emergency search protocols, especially in high-risk areas like forests bordering residential zones and abandoned construction sites. Avery's summary report, presented to the state-level professional council, clearly analyzed each critical error: failure to secure the last seen point within the first 24 hours, overlooking timesheet cross-checks, inadequate site searches, lack of route-based statement analysis, absence of evidence, ceiling standards, and especially the inability to link subsequent cases due to missing federal information systems. This report quickly became required reading in training courses for new investigators in South Carolina and was shared with neighboring counties to prevent similar mistakes. As a result of the case, South Carolina revised procedures for adult missing persons reports. Any report involving young women students or disappearances in forest construction areas had to be classified as high risk and trigger search deployment within hours, rather than waiting overnight. Screening of construction personnel, industrial sites and seasonal workers was tightened, requiring immediate cross-checking of employee records when the disappearance area was near mobile labor forces. At the same time, small items once dismissed, such as fabric scraps, metal ties or loose notes, were now required to be preserved under forensic standards, even if their initial value was unclear. A broader impact came from Paulson's notebook. The case led South Carolina investigators to incorporate repeat offender behavioral assessment and personal code analysis into new protocols, something rarely considered before in nobody cases. These reforms were seen as a powerful shift in awareness, changing how the state's criminal justice system viewed opportunistic predators within mobile work communities. In Lexington County, the aftershocks resonated at the community level as well. The case forced residents to realize that a forgotten file did not mean an unsolvable one, and that modern forensic technology could resurrect cases thought permanently buried. The persistence of the cold case unit, especially Avery, became motivation for the county to invest more heavily in file preservation, digitization of old records, and re-examination of other long-dormant missing persons cases to ensure no case would vanish among the storage shelves, as Helen's once had. When the verdict was announced, and the court completed all procedures, the Helen Ward file was officially marked closed after 36 years. At the case closure ceremony, a sheriff's office representative emphasized that without the meticulous terrain reconstruction, timing models, evidence analysis, combined with interstate coordination, the case might never have been solved. Helen's file closed not only as a solved crime, but as proof of the importance of never downplaying any disappearance and never letting time erode the ability to pursue truth. The case became a core professional lesson that adult missing persons investigations must be approached with the same seriousness as any violent crime. That every small detail can become a bridge across 30 years, and that persistence in investigation can return a victim to their rightful place in history, not as a name in a cold file, but as a person whose voice is restored after 36 years of silence. Looking back at the entire Helen Ward case, from the initial errors in 1965, the years the file was forgotten, to the effort to restart and solve it after more than 3 decades, readers in the United States today can draw practical lessons about personal safety, community vigilance, and the responsibility of law enforcement systems. One key detail of the story is how 1965 authorities treated Helen's disappearance as a probable voluntary return, leading to delayed initial response. This is a powerful reminder that in today's modern America, despite tremendous technological advances, reporting and handling missing persons cases, especially young women, students, or pedestrians in remote areas, still needs to happen immediately. Another lesson comes from Helen disappearing on a familiar route where she felt safe. This reflects the reality that many victims today encounter danger in everyday spaces: parking lots, jogging trails, residential areas. Proactively sharing travel plans with friends, using location-sharing apps, and avoiding walking alone in low-traffic areas remain effective measures even now. The case also demonstrates the value of evidence preservation and storage. A single hair, a small fabric scrap dismissed as meaningless in 1965, became the key to reopening the entire case. When mtDNA technology advanced, this underscores the importance of investing in forensics and digitizing records in the modern U.S. justice system, because today's cases may be solved by technology 10, 20, or 30 years from now. Finally, the persistence of the cold case unit investigators, especially Avery Paulson's confession, and the community's unrelenting effort, serve as proof of the value of perseverance. In a vast society like the United States, where many families still carry the pain of unsolved disappearances, the Helen Ward case reminds us that justice may be delayed, but does not have to vanish, as long as we keep files alive, keep searching for truth, and keep believing that every person deserves to have their voice recovered. Thank you for following to the end of this 36-year journey to solve the case. A journey that reminds us that justice can be delayed, but never forgotten. If you want to continue joining these stories of unraveling mysteries, please subscribe to the channel and see you in the next video.